Hello and welcome, and in today's video I'm going to share with you the top 10 most undervalued arc tames. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. In at number 10 we have got the Megalodon, and this creature is here just simply because, like, I find with ocean creatures people go for basilos and creatures like that, and maybe Moses in the case of some bosses, and I feel like, you know, it's a bit undervalued in that sense because, like, you know, it's the Megalodon. You would think that people would be taming this tons and tons, and they'd just be taming these things all over the place. But actually, from experience, people don't really tame these things that much, and I think that's a little bit of an undervaluement, if you will, because, you know, these creatures are actually pretty decent, and they deal the bleed ability, and yeah, maybe they're not as strong as something like a Moser. I still find they are quite useful for just general underwater travel, and it's partly because I have a bias to Megalodons, because I'm not really a hater of these things. I love these things. I've been taming these things for years and years now, and obviously I'm going to be biased towards the creatures on this list, but I just find it's undervalued, and I feel like people should be taming this creature more, as I don't think it gets what it deserves, really. Next up we have got the Baryonyx, and this creature is here just because the Barry is one of those tames where I find they're so useful for doing caving, and people these days don't really use them that much, and I kind of feel like that's a shame, really. These creatures are just so nicely and heavily used, or at least they were heavily used back in the day, and it seems like there's been a bit of a drop off with these things, and people tend to talk about them less and less. And yes, they're not the newest creatures out there, and maybe there are some other creatures which you might prefer for doing caving. That's perfectly acceptable, but I think people should still be taming these things and using these things. And I'm not saying like no one tames these things and that's a shame. I'm saying, like, people should tame these things more and experience them more, as loads of people actually just go caving on foot and they don't even bring a creature in, and they end up just dying loads of times. Like, in cases like that, a Baryonyx can be really useful, especially considering on ASA at the moment you haven't got Shadow Mains and things like that, and, you know, they're so useful for that I find they really should be tamed more, and I think that they definitely do deserve more as creatures. It makes sense to tame them, but people these days are being a little bit more skimpish with them. Now, I also did want to put the Moser here as well. I did talk about earlier how, like, yeah, Mosers are stronger than Megalodons. They definitely are, but I find that these creatures are in some ways even more undervalued, and they definitely do need a lot more work than the Megalodon to become some really great creatures. And obviously you got the X-Mosers and X-Megs on Gen 1, but still, the Moser these days actually isn't as used as much as you might think. It's not really used at all. Maybe you might use it for the Moder boss fights, but I find Spinos are commonly used in the case instead of Mosers for that, although people have obviously used Mosers for it. But now with loads of new sea creatures out with like mods and all of that, the Moser just seems very basic and in a lot of ways not really worth taming, and I think that's a bit of a shame. They definitely could do with some TLC, especially for the Moser over the Megalodon. And yeah, like, the people just don't tame them as much as they used to, and, you know, they're supposed to kind of be the kings of the ocean, so in that sense it is quite a shame. In at number 7 we have got the Carb Enemies, and this creature is here just simply because, like, you know, it's so commonly just basically used as bait, essentially, in a way. Not exactly bait, but people just use these things to get loads of keratin out of them, and I find that actually as a tame creature they're pretty decent. And yes, maybe they're not the fastest in the world. This does have some increased speed, if you're wondering, by the way, because they are a lot slower than this usually. They're actually pretty decent at swimming in the water, and they're not the slowest things in the world, and give you a good introduction to that. You also, just as a general creature, they're just nice to have. It's useful to have a Carb Enemies, and yes, maybe they're not essential. I find if maybe they got a little bit of TLC, they really could be some great creatures which people use, like the Trike and the Stego. It could go to that extent if Wildcard gave these things a little bit more thoughts, because they're not really thought of commonly, just as a general thing. You just think Carb Enemies is like, oh, the source of keratin, and that's kind of all you think of them. But if you think of them as a tame and actually try and get some use out of them, you'll find that these creatures are actually pretty decent as just a general underwater creature in the early stages of the game, and I definitely do use them for that quite a bit. And although yes, again, the speed is not the best, that is not going to be your main concern, especially in the early stages of the game. You just want those creatures that can actually just enable you to do those things. You're not really in a position where you want the best creatures out there because you're not far enough in the game yet. Next up, we have got the Quetzal, and this creature is here because I found in the 2015, 2016, wherever the Quetzal was released, I think it was late 2015, but it might have been to 2016. Again, not too sure on that, but either way, in those early stages of Ark, when the Quetzal came out, it was really just used so widely. It was such a cool creature, and although very difficult to tame, with that platform saddle on it, it really did make all the difference. And when the flyer speed leveling and all of that got nerfed, there was just a massive decline in Quetzals, as you know, they're not the fastest out there, and also there were just some other creatures came out that people might like to use more, and that's kind of where the Quetzals had a bit of a downfall. And nowadays the Quetzal isn't tamed all too much, at least not as much as I think it should. And yes, I definitely could say this creature could use some TLC just to buff it up a little bit, but also I kind of just prefer Ark with flyer speed leveling. I also do want to know your opinions. Are you pro flyer speed leveling, or are you against flyer speed leveling? Because I'm definitely very much for it. In at number 5, we've got the Carno, and I put this creature here as just people seem to dismiss the Carno for something like an Aloe, and although yes, that is objectively a better creature, I find that the Carno can be just extremely useful as quite an early on carnivore. You don't even need that saddle yet, and if you're on ASA, saddles are very easy to come by in drops, and also you can just kill an adult one, and then if it has a baby one attached to it, it's just such an easy, simple way of taming a Carno. Or you can just tame one the traditional way. It's really not that difficult whatsoever, and once you have one, they are a carnivore that can deal loads of bleed damage and just generally have quite a nice amount of mobility and quite a nice size as well. You can be pretty stealthy on a Carno, and although yes, maybe their footsteps are a bit louder than you might expect, you can be reasonably well hidden with a Carno, which maybe something like an Aloe or something larger than that, you would struggle a little bit, because you know, Rexes kind of stick out a lot more than a Carno. Carnos just, they're a little bit more reserved, and I like them for that. They're a good bridge between something like a Raptor and an Aloe. It's just, they're such useful creatures, I find, and I use them tons and tons all over the place. And I find people really discount these creatures for creatures like Aloes, like I've said before, and I kind of find that's a shame, because I think these really do stand by themselves for being really great creatures. And obviously because of that, I'm going to put them on this list because I find that they definitely are undervalued creatures, and I wish that people paid them a little bit more respect, as I think it is definitely well deserved. In at number 4, we've got the UT, and the UT isn't here just because people don't really use it. I find it's undervalued for its versatility, because people just use these things in boss fights for that one case where you can buff your creatures, and that's it. People won't use them for other things, and I find that is a huge waste of a creature like this, as they are capable of dealing tons of damage, and you can even just use them to fight bosses with, although that's not my preferred use. They're just really great carnivores that can traverse maps just quite easily compared to something like the Rex, and obviously they're kind of better than Aloe in some ways and all of that, and obviously then you can debuff creatures. They just work really well as creatures to travel around the map with, and you can even do meta runs and things like that. And I know that seems a little bit far-fetched for some people, but I find they are just really great creatures for that. And obviously the RG is going to be better for meta runs because it's a flying creature. Still, you could do quite a lot with something like a UT apart from just use it for fighting bosses. And I want to know, what do you use the UT for apart from in bosses? Because I'm not too sure if there's many people out there that use the UT for many other things apart from that, and that's why I think it's undervalued. I don't think it's undervalued as in people don't use this creature or care about this creature, because they do, but it's undervalued for its versatility. In at number 3, we've got the gas bags, and this creature is here just because I find it can just be a really useful arc creature in general, and people don't really use it. And yes, there is a bit of a learning curve, and by the time I recorded this b-roll, I really wasn't great at flying this thing, but now I'm quite a significant amount better. I'm not going to say I'm a god at flying this thing, but I can actually get it to kind of move where I like. So I do excuse in advance my quite terrible gas bag flying, because yeah, I really did not do a great job with this b-roll. I have to re-record it at some point and, you know, get it all looking like I can't, that I can fly the gas bag instead of I can't. But either way, these creatures insanely useful just as a general tank as well. If you puff them up, there's a lot of damage reduction, and obviously great for doing meta runs and things like that, because they've got tons of weight, and you don't even need a saddle to ride one. But if you do chuck the saddle on, obviously you get extra armor and another player can join you. So it's actually quite useful if you have friends in the Arc world, and you know, you might want to bring them along with you for a meta run. And I know these are all quite basic uses for the gas bags. I find people don't really use them as much, and I know the Maywing is like that go-to traveling mount, and you can just do a lot with the Maywing. I find maybe give the gas bags a go if you have access to the gas bags, because I find they're a little bit undervalued as a creature, and I find people can do a lot with gas bags. It's just they don't really end up doing anything with them, and I find that's quite a shame, really. I wish people did actually use these things a lot more, because they just work so well in so many situations, especially for turret soaking and metal runs, to just name the main two that they use for. So yes, gas bags, really undervalued creature in my opinion, and I hope that more people use this creature going into the future. In at number 2, we have got the Crystal Wyvern, and this creature is simply here because I find, compared to the normal Wyverns, these are extremely undervalued, and people have been saying that the Ember Crystal Wyvern is really a highlight for them. For me, it's the Blood Crystal Wyvern. Obviously, this I'm pretty sure is neither. It's just a Tropical Crystal Wyvern. They really are so useful, and a few people in my community have been saying yes, they definitely do really agree with this, and the general consensus is, oh, the Crystal Wyverns are just not as strong as Wyverns, but actually I find they're even more effective than all Wyverns, and that obviously does come from the fact that the taming method is a lot easier. Yes, it is capped behind level 60, and also you have to knock out one to get the Primal Crystal in the first place, but once you've done that, it's not really that difficult, and even that bit isn't difficult whatsoever. So, you know, these things are ridiculously easy to tame, and they're just such good creatures. They really do have to be on this list, because people extremely undervalue them, and I find that they need to be on this list because they need more attention. They really do deserve it. They are great creatures which are strong in all aspects, apart from turning circles, but you know, that's not great on the Wyvern anyway, and I just find they're so useful for so many things, even more so than the Wyvern, although they're kind of the same creature, although I do find these are better because they're just easier to tame, and there's a lot less of a lengthy process you have to go through to get them. I really do find they're extremely effective, and I wish people use these creatures more. And in at number 1, we've got the Bloodstalker, and this creature is here because I find, yes, people do use it for traveling and all of that. It gets a bit undervalued over the Maywing, and I find it can be really effective. Also, I do excuse my Bloodstalker flying. Really was not the best at flying it back when I recorded this b-roll, but I assure you I'm better now. And obviously I'm going to have to re-record those gas bags and Bloodstalker b-rolls. I will add it onto my list of stuff to do, but also I find that these are the best ocean creature out there. Just, I know they're not ocean creatures, but they're the best kind of dealing with the underwater environment, in my opinion. And I didn't show any of that in this b-roll, which is another reason why I really do need to re-record it. Either way, these creatures are just so great at traversing underwater environments. They're so quick and speedy, and they can deal quite hefty amounts of damage as well, which you might not expect. And maybe you're not going to take it to do alpha creatures, but you can just easily zip away from them. Also, on top of that, they can glide on the top of the water as well, so kind of just to escape danger even more, you can just simply skim across the top of the water and get out of the way of all of those creatures that are trying to attack you. And also on top of that, you kind of do have like an awesome spyglass, but without the need for an awesome spyglass, so you can see the aggros of all the creatures. Extremely useful, especially in an underwater environment when the visibility isn't quite as great as obviously just on land. So I do find they're extremely useful for everything like that as well. And obviously if you're on Gen 1, you can warrant loads and loads of use out of these things. They're kind of like rock drakes in that sense. They are like a creature which you essentially really have to use for that purpose. So yes, in my opinion, the Bloodstalker is the most undervalued creature for what I think it could do. I just find people don't use it for that, and that's why I put it in at number 1. The top 10 most disregarded Arctames. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. In at number 10, we have got the Megalosaurus, and although this creature is widely used on maps like Arboration, I find it could definitely be used a lot more, and it does spawn on maps like the islands. Like, you can go into caves, like the artifact of the Devourer cave, I think has a few, and the artifact of the Massive, or the artifact of the Hunter, I think has a few lying around there. And obviously you can use Creature Finder Deluxe if that's your thing as well. If you have access to that, it really does help out, especially for you ASA players out there, because it is accessible to everyone. But on normal Arc, if you're a console player, I'm sorry, you won't have access to that. Also, these things do have a wealth of abilities as well, which really does make them quite a special creature to behold. They can just gnash away at small creatures in their mouth with no issues whatsoever. Honestly, it's so easy to kill things like Microraptors. They just simply can't get to you anymore, even though in this case they did. But you know, the thought is there, and I find it often in a lot of scenarios it really does help out, especially when there's not too many of them. If you get loads, then not many creatures are going to be able to ward them off, but the Stego is actually a pretty good shout. But obviously that's not going to be on this list because the Stego is quite widely used for PvP, and you can actually use this creature for PvP as well. And I know I'm not the biggest PvP player out there, so PvP players out there, feel free to disagree with me if you think this wouldn't be good. But I think considering its size and the damage output, and considering that it only is really too useful at night time if you're doing a short raid that is not relatively too difficult, these things can be pretty useful, and they're pretty stealthy creatures. That, again, if I got that completely wrong, make sure to comment that down below, as I always do. I want to know your thoughts. Just for general PvE use, sorry. These creatures are just really great for traversing around the map, great for defeating the Raasclark on Arboration, obviously just great on Arboration in general, but I think they're really great carnivores that deserve a lot more respect than they already get. Next up on the list, we have got ourselves the Carbenemies, and although this creature seems just like a pretty useless creature which you'll see all over the beaches on maps like the island, it really is one which can be extremely useful in the early stages of the game, just for general use as an underwater mount, and just as a general mount for getting around the area and just having a little explore. Obviously this creature isn't going to give you the best experience out of every Arc creature, as they are particularly slow, and that can be quite frustrating. But things like Quetzals are slow as well, and they are later game tames, although they are a little bit outdated, and you do find with creatures like this you really do see their age in some regards. And especially if Wildcard did give these things to TLC, I think it would really boost the amount of players that would be using these things, as they definitely could do with a couple of extra features and abilities to make themselves generally just be better creatures. Maybe they could even get the hydration buff underwater, just something quite simple that would just make these creatures a lot better. But I do find their main use is being your first underwater mount in the game. Yes, their saddle can be a little bit expensive, requiring 10 cementing paste, at least I think it's 10 cementing paste, but they can just be really good in those early stages to get yourself those silica pearls and get yourself some oil. Yes, you can get it from trilobites, but I find if you want to get it in some larger amounts, and also generally just quicker, unless there's just trilobites absolutely everywhere, I find the Carbenemies is just the way to go. They're really useful creatures, honestly very disregarded in my opinion, and I wish people use these things more. Sadly they don't, but you know, maybe in the future. Next up, we have got ourselves the Bloodstalker, and although this unassuming little creature spawning in the bog biome on Genesis 1 seems like it would be used quite a lot, and although yes, it is actually used reasonably widely among players, the Maywing has sort of taken a place as a better travelling mount out there, but that's actually not why I put it on this list. Contrary to popular belief, I think that the best use for this thing isn't just to be an insane travel mount, but is to be that epic underwater ocean creature that you've all been looking for. At least I've been looking for it, and in my recent Arc exploration I have found that the Bloodstalker is an extremely effective creature for use in underwater travel. It really is one of the most diverse creatures in so many ways, especially again linking back to underwater exploration. They essentially have an awesome spyglass, if you will, where you can see the aggros of all the creatures as well. You can't see their health and stamina and all their other stats and torpor and things like that, but still you can see the aggros of creatures, and especially with the lack of visibility in a place like the ocean, it can be extremely useful to know if you need to evade some danger. Also, these creatures just generally are really useful mounts, and I feel like the Maywing has taken too much of the spotlight, if you will. I know it is a really great creature, but I find that if we have a little bit more creature variety in our life, we can find some better uses for creatures, the Bloodstalker being a great underwater traveling mount, and that's my niche that I find it to be good in. But if you find other niches with creatures by exploring with them, I find it can just be really useful for general game development, especially as a PvE player, but I could see how it would possibly be useful in some PvP scenarios as well. In at number 7, we have got ourselves the Mosasaurus, and this creature is here because I feel like with the Mosa, you might think of it as the king of the sea, the top of the top in the ocean biome, but actually creatures like the Basilo tend to get used a lot more, and I feel that is a big shame, considering this creature's size and general status that you might think it would have. It really does not in the world of Ark today, and although yes, they could be widely useful for the Moda boss and just generally underwater killing and just destroying everything in the underwater biome, and they're actually pretty decent for underwater caving on the island as well. They really do need something more, and this definitely does come into needing a TLC, but I find they're disregarded a little bit more than they need to be, as they are still pretty decent, very useful creatures of today. But Wildcard, I really do urge you to add some more support to this creature, as I do think they need it. They just need that lift to really become some powerful creatures, as there are just other creatures right now which do it a lot better than this thing. Coming up next, we have got ourselves the Velonosaur, and I feel like this humble creature on extinction really does deserve a lot more attention. This thing spawns in the desert dome on the map, and you know, a lot of people did tame it back in the day, and more people did tame Velonosaurs back when Gen 2 came out with the Velonosaurs, and they definitely just show Wildcard does give these things a lot of respect, and I don't think they need really any TLC in any regard, you could say. Although the one improvement could be if you level up the melee damage, their spines, you can call them, they will actually scale with the melee damage, because they don't, only your melee attacks will. But maybe you could say that is a little bit too OP, and I think everyone would be using those if you did do that, but still, these deserve a lot more attention. Okay, the Velonosaur is a really nice niche of a creature which you can't really find anywhere else, and you'll find loads of cool uses for it, and I find that is really useful to have. Again, linking back to the Bloodstalker, if you experiment around with loads of creatures in the game, you'll probably find some creatures that you really like using for very specific tasks. And with this thing, it's just generally attacking creatures from afar, and you'll find it just be quite useful as a general traveling mount. At least I have, is you can just quickly kill things off from a good distance away, and it really does aid me in my travels. But obviously you can find your niche with this thing as well. In at number 5, we have got ourselves the Carnotaurus, and I really do want to talk about this creature quite a lot, because I am definitely a Carno lover, so I do have quite a lot of bias, but you know, I do have bias for this whole list as I am the one making it, although I've factored a little bit of just general things that I have found around, because I don't just want to play into my opinions, although they are largely mine. I do want to know that. I do want to tell you that, sorry. And also, as always, comment down below what your thoughts are on this list, and if you don't agree with it, then put your suggestions down, as I do want to know, and I want to take feedback from my community to kind of aid my videos and make these top 10s more applicable to you and me as well, because obviously I still want to have the reasoning behind all of it, and if there's some good reasoning for some good creatures, then I will definitely probably morph my decisions slightly, and I definitely have had a lot of decisions morphed by you, so keep that coming, because it really does help me as a person, and you know, just getting loads of different views, it's just really nice to have. And I have quite a nice position in a sense, because I just have access to views where some other people maybe don't quite as much as me, especially as personalized as I get it. But speaking about the Carno, and not you guys, although love you guys a lot more than this thing, the Carnotaurus is a creature which deals the bleed damage, and is relatively fast and agile, and come on, it's really easy to tame. You'll have no issues with it whatsoever, especially on ASA. These things are dead easy to tame, no issues whatsoever. Just kill the parent Carno as long as it has a baby attached, then boom, you just press a button and you've got yourself a Carno. Obviously you can just lead these things into a trap as well. Sometimes you don't even need a trap, just stand on top of a cliff and then just shoot down on it, and then boom. It's really easy to tame these things, and they're really useful, fast, agile creatures. People usually go for aloes instead, but I find it's a good bridge and a nice creature to have. Now, I often find the Quetzal isn't talked about nowadays, and it really does in a lot of ways sadly show its age. This creature is deadlily slow, if that's even a word. Either way, it's a really slow flyer, and it really did work better when flyer speed leveling was a thing. I know ages and ages ago, obviously you can activate it with mods and whatnot, and there's a setting for it nowadays, but all official servers, as far as I'm concerned, do not have this ability anymore, obviously, since that happened, because they're official servers, they keep it official. Either way, these creatures have really just seen a downfall in recent years as creatures like the Rhinoganatha and the Astrodelphis, the Tropical Natives came out. They're just more useful for this kind of job, and although no flyer really does replace the platform saddle that the Quetzal has, it's not really the best that you can get out there, and you can really just get some better solutions than this nowadays, as it really isn't the best creature to fly around on. But if they gave this thing a bit of TLC, then I really think it could do a lot better, and just generally I think it gets a little bit less respect than it deserves, as they still can be quite useful to this day. In at number 3, we have got the Megalodon, and I kind of have to put this creature here in my opinion. I find like the Megalodon is by far like one of my favourite prehistoric creatures, so again I'm going to have a lot of bias here, but I really like this creature in Arc. I've only taken these things for years and years and years. Really did enjoy when they get the TLC as well. That was a nice cool addition for these creatures to have. Showed wildcard, she did have some respect for these ocean beasts, and in a lot of regards I'll say they're better than something like a Mosa, and I use them a hell of a lot more, but I don't see loads of other people using them, and I don't feel like they need too much TLC. They really just do stand alone as their own thing, but I feel like people just skip these things and disregard them, and they're really useful for general underwater travel, for defeating the Moda on Gen 1, and even underwater caving. And although that can be done with a Barry, I find the Megalodon does work quite effectively. It's just nice to have a Megalodon. It's a really easy to tame, effective, useful underwater mount, and you can do a lot with it. Although its turning circle isn't the greatest, the Wyverns isn't either, so anything about its mobility, you know, there's some really good creatures out there loads of people use that have terrible mobility, although not the strongest argument I've never heard for these things. I really think they could be used a lot more. Speaking of the Barry, in number 2 we have actually got the Baryonyx, and I'm going to put this creature here, as with the rise of creatures like the Shadowmane, and also just ever since the Thyla's release, this creature has had a decline in uses, and it goes down, I'm pretty sure, year by year. Less people talk about this thing and less people use it, but it is just so useful for doing any kind of caving. I really think it deserves to be on this list 100%. I just don't really see people using these things nowadays and talk to them as much. Again, I said it before, but I want to repeat it for emphasis, because you know, these creatures are so easy to tame, and although yes, maybe they use fish meat is really not that hard to come by, and you don't need to tame these things up to 100% effectiveness or use all that prime fish meat. Unless you're an official, then it is going to take quite a while, but still, it's not the hardest thing to come by in the game, and it is definitely worth the effort because of their insane caving ability. They're also just generally great carnivores to have traveling around the map, and obviously if you right click or whatever the equivalent second attack button is for you, if you're a console player, or mobile player of course, then you can use the spin attack underwater, and it can stun creatures up to the side of a Megalodon. Again, really useful for doing underwater caves. Like I said when I was talking about the Megalodon, the Barry is also a great option which can be used, but it's mainly great for caving and also just as a general traveling mount. Again, you can find your niche with this thing, but maybe stick to with what people find this is the best for first and see how you go. And finally, in a one, we got the Crystal Wyvern, and I'm putting this thing here as Wyverns are heavily used by tons of Arc players, and especially considering Raasclark, as far as I'm concerned, is still the most popular Arc map out there. Not sure what Fielders have done to that statistic or not. It's crazy to feel how the Crystal Wyvern gets like no respect compared to the Wyvern, and it is heavily disregarded. In some ways I find that maybe it has an easier taming method, and because of that it has some kind of psychological nocebo that these creatures just generally are worse, but in most cases I find they're better. Loads of you out there have been saying that you really like the Ember Crystal Wyvern. That's your favourite. For me, it's the Blood Crystal Wyvern. Obviously this is a Tropical Crystal Wyvern, but still the point stands, it's a Crystal Wyvern, and the B-roll works with what I'm talking about. Either way, these things, yes, maybe they are locked behind a level 60 kind of a barrier to actually tame one. You need to knock out one anyway to get the Primal Crystal. It's really not that hard. Note runs are easy, and that Primal Crystal is so easy to fetch, especially if you have a net gun now, considering all of that exists, and they work just as well as Wyverns, if not better, especially considering the easier tame method. Though they work tons better, and you can get them way earlier on in the game, and their abilities are, you could even say, new for today. They just seem really cool, and nothing really has been done like it since, and I feel like they deserve a lot more credit and success than they've gotten. So that is why I'm putting this creature in at number 1. I think it deserves it the most out of any creature in the game. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I really hope that you all have enjoyed this one, as I've definitely enjoyed making it. As always, comment down below what is the most disregarded Arc 10 to you, and if you didn't agree with this list, put your 10 in the comments below, and I will see you all later.